Okay, well, welcome everybody. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning to wherever you are joining us from around the world. I can see the numbers are pouring in the gates here. We're up to 60, 70, 80 and going north. I think we've had over 400 registrations or so for today's meeting. So let's just kick things off. We're going to be reasonably brief today. I'd like to welcome Jim Gerrish joining us again. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Carl. Great to be back.
Thanks for coming back. You keep coming back. It's wonderful to have you. So, and a big mention to today as well. A big thank you to Stockman Grass Farmer, who have been great partners with us over the last few months, bringing some really great webinar series and content to our community out there, along with Jim. And we've got a bit more information down the track in today's webinar about a bit of a combination deal that we're running with Stockman Grass Farming. So this is sort of part two, really, of some webinar on really capturing the last summer's bounty and then heading into winter. And really, it's about how we're planning for the months ahead and making the most of that. So I'll let Jim get into that shortly. But here's today's run sheet. A little bit of information about what we're running through today. But just first of all, what I'd like to do is just make everyone aware, as usual, that feel free to send in any questions that you have as soon as you want to. If you've got some burning questions for Jim that are related to stockpile grazing or closed season planning, etc. Just go down to find your little panel Q&A button and send any questions in. Or if you've got questions that are come along during the session, just send those through. And for whatever questions that we don't get to during the session, Jim and I will run a little a separate session between ourselves, and you'll receive the recording of the Q&A afterwards. What we'll do in a moment is just review a few little one-liners related to winter grazing. That's the topic there. Hear from your peers. There are a few one-liners that we've shared in the previous session, but it's just as relevant to reshare those. And then we'll go over to Jim. He'll run through his presentation on managing the extended grazing season, understanding animal needs and forage quality, strip grazing to manage rumen function, using grass inventory to plan winter grazing, strategic use of stockpile pastures, as well as some tools and techniques for winter grazing. Then we'll go into a few live Q&A. We'll keep that reasonably brief, but make sure you send the questions through, and we'll do a comprehensive Q&A and video of those, and send any that we don't get through today to you afterwards. Then there'll be an invitation to run a bit of a discovery session with us here at Myer Grazing, the combination deal that we've got with Stockman Grass Farmer, and we'll let you get on your merry way and happy grazing. But without further ado, this is just a couple of those one-liners that were sent in about a month or two now, leading up to these sessions from some of our community out there, and it was really about this one here from Chuck, South Dakota, was get confident with your pasture estimates. It sets you up to extend your grazing season. So it's all about really making sure that you can understand what forage you've got available, and making those good estimates of what you have to be able to plan out your grazing plan and extend it. It took 3 years of good planning to kick the hay habit for Hugh down in Texas. So this is all about, whatever your goals for extending your grazing season, you might not be able to do this all in 1 year, and it takes a considerable amount of planning. So bite-sized chunks. Nothing wrong with being ambitious, but also don't beat yourself up if you can't achieve it all in one season. And this next one here sort of relates to that. It was, eating into your residual is not extending your grazing season. It's cutting it off at the knees. So this is about not just extending this grazing season. This is about extending the grazing season after that and after that. So cutting yourself off at the knees by eating into your residual will just essentially not set you up for the growing season, and all of a sudden you're into a bit of a spiral. So thanks, Lucy in Colorado. Jim, it's now over to you. So I'll stop sharing my screen and you can get moving with it.
Okay, thank you, Carl. We'll see if this one comes right up and then we'll go. Maybe I should try a different one. How about this one? I think that's the one we're looking for. Okay, welcome back, everybody. And for those of you who didn't view the webinar we did a couple of months ago, I don't even remember where it was, I'll say a couple of months ago. In that one, I talked about selecting forages for stockpiling, strategies for growing, quality stockpile. We talked some about annual pastures. So that was setting up the feed supply. And what we're going to do tonight is get into effectively using that feed supply. I want to start from the standpoint of making sure we all understand what our animals' nutritional needs are and what kind of forage quality we might expect in stockpile pastures. And then we're going to talk about forage quality, crude protein, digestibility, how the nitrogen carbon or protein energy ratio affects rumen function. We're going to talk about using selective grazing as a management tool, and eventually it'll all roll together. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So how do you know what you have for forage quality when you're grazing in the dormant season? One of the ways of doing that is collecting forage from your stockpiled pastures. Now, obviously, this field here is a green active growing season, but it's a picture that I have with grass in my hand. So the best way to collect those samples to get an assessment of what our feed supply is for the winter is what we call an imitation grab sample. This is where you go out, I think I hit a wrong button, where we go out and we watch how the animals are grazing, and then we try to do our best job of collecting those parts of the plants that the animals are actually eating. If you take the entire plant that's standing out in the field and cut it down at ground level and get an analysis on that, that tells you nothing about what the animals are really eating. So with these imitation grab samples, if a person is experienced and trained in doing it, we can get within about 1% of what the animal, the cow or sheep out there will be grazing. The animal is almost always going to be selecting a higher quality diet than what our sample tells us. If we're not doing a good job of watching the cattle and we're just going out and kind of randomly grabbing stuff, the protein estimate might be 3 or 4% off. Similarly, the better job you do of watching the animal, the closer you're going to get the TDN or digestibility level close to what the animal is doing. So that's how we go about getting our samples. We do an analysis, and then we start thinking about what are they actually telling us. One of the analysis we commonly get is crude protein. Crude protein is not determined by in the lab actually extracting protein compounds or protein molecules out of the forage. They simply extract all the nitrogen and multiply it by 6.25. That's because the average protein molecule contains 16% nitrogen. That crude protein measure is going to include nitrogen. That's included. That's actually in amino acids and protein, but it'll also pick up nitrates, nitrites, ammonium, any other sort of free nitrogen that's in that plant. This is a useful measure when we're dealing with ruminant animals, because ruminants can use any of that nitrogen. Monogastrics, like people, pigs, dogs, we have to consume intact amino acids or intact proteins in our diet, and we have to do it on a daily basis. Ruminants do not need to do that, and we'll explore why it works that way a few slides down the line. When we're looking at the energy content of the plant, it starts with digestibility. We have fiber in the plant that can be digested. We also have cell solubles, free sugars, highly digestible material. So all of these digestible materials, they can be digested in a live rumen. And we can actually, if you've seen these cows that have portholes in their sides, where you can open them up, reach inside, pull forage out, that's getting a sample of what the animal actually consumed. That is the most accurate measure of the animal's diet. We call that in vivo DMD, dry matter digestibility, because it's kind of difficult to work with these animals year round and on an ongoing basis and do a large number of samples. We also have something that we call an artificial rumen. You take rumen fluid out of an animal, put it in beakers, hold it at a constant 102-degree temperature, which is basically what the rumen temperature is, and we get an in vitro DMD. We can also measure different fiber components and make a calculated value of energy content. What's important is all of these measures give us a similar result. Very often you'll hear people talk, graziers, nutritionists, talking about TDN, total digestible nutrients. Total digestible nutrients is another representation of energy content of the forage, and it will be calculated from one of these measures that we're looking at here. So when we're grazing animals, and particularly in the dormant season, when almost everybody has the perspective of, oh, that dried brown grass, it doesn't have any nutritive value. Well, actually it does. It might not have everything we need, but as long as we have an animal with a properly functioning rumen, they can digest a lot of that fiber and extract energy from it. So the question is, how do we keep them properly running every day? That's where the DMD crude protein ratio comes in. We can also express this as a carbon nitrogen ratio, a TDN to crude protein ratio. If we're working with DMD, for most of the time with ruminants, we would like that ratio, that value, to be between 4 and 6. And we'll explore this again in upcoming slides. When we have high producing animals, grass-fed beef, lactating dairy cows, the ratio will be higher because those animals do have a higher protein requirement than do animals at maintenance. We can run at maintenance animals at a lower ratio. Now, is an animal going to die if that ratio is at 3? No, they're just not going to perform as efficiently. Similarly, if we get a ratio that's 7 or 8, they're not going to die. They're just not going to perform optimally. So during the growing season, I see no value at all, you know, in terms of practicing graziers out on the farm or ranch. I don't see any need in taking forage samples when we have green growing grass. In this example here, we're looking at a digestibility of about 64%, crude protein at 14%. So the ratio is 4.6. It's just right smack in the middle of what it needs to have a functional rumen and optimal livestock performance. So we pretty well know this. You don't need to go out, spend the time, spend the money to get a sample to tell you what basically we can see with our eyes. When we get into dormant season pastures, it becomes a different deal. You know, remember, a lot of people think that brown grass that has been frosted, it's left standing in the field at the end of the season, they automatically think, well, that's no good. The reality is it really depends on what species we're dealing with and how that particular pasture had been utilized over the course of the growing season. And so here we have cattle in the snow. And if you look in the background, you see trees in the background. There's no leaves out there. This is not, you know, early season snow like the September 8th snow that just hit a good part of Wyoming and Colorado. This is deep into winter when I took this picture. And yet the digestibility on that forage is still 58%. The crude protein is 10%. And we have that ratio at 5.8, right in the range it needs to be. So these animals are going to do fine with no supplementation at all. we have good enough forage quality out there to, carry them through a good part of the winter. And in some environments, it's through the entire winter. So last session that we did, we talked about how do you manage your pasture in the growing season to create this type of high quality stockpile that will be adequate nutrition for your livestock. Now, let's get into a little different deal. This is the previous picture was a predominantly cool season, actually, it was an entirely cool season pasture. This one is predominantly warm season. This is a native warm season grass pasture. I probably took this picture either in Nebraska or Kansas. I think that this is a Nebraska picture. So we look here, the digestibility on the forage is 52%. And a dry pregnant beef cow's digestibility requirement for maintenance is down around 50%. However, her crude protein requirement is 6.5 to 7.5, depending on particular characteristics of that cow. So we look at our digestibility to crude protein ratio here, and it's 9.4. That tells us that these animals are going to require protein supplementation to be able to perform on this particular pasture. If we supplement with the right amount and type of protein, they can get the energy they need out of this forage. Let's go to another situation. How bad is still okay? So digestibility on this, and this is a seeded rangeland mix in Montana. Intermediate wheatgrass, crested wheatgrass. I think there's some pubescent wheatgrass in there. But these particular grasses, and because this is a full season's growth accumulated, the digestibility is only 48%, which is below the maintenance requirement of a dry pregnant cow. So they are going to be deficient in energy. No matter what we do about the protein supplementation, they're still going to be deficient in energy. Crude protein content's only 4%, so we've got a ratio at 12. This type of forage here, if we do not supplement and we just leave those cows out there entirely on their own for a couple of months, we're going to come back and we're going to find a lot of dead cows, and the survivors are going to be skinny. This is not a diet that they can function on. So in this case, we need to be supplementing with both protein and energy. That's why it's important to take some forage samples, especially if you're just beginning to really push the envelope and extend your grazing season. You need to know what you're working with. So in this case, if you failed to supplement, you would have dead animals. You would have horrible performance. It would be a wreck. If we go back a couple of slides, and I'm going to go back to this one here, if we just went by what the neighbor said, no, that dry brown grass is crap and you have to supplement them, where we would be is spending money to feed supplements that we don't need. Might not be a performance wreck, but it could be a financial wreck. So it's important to know what we have to work with. This table here is was taken at the USDA Meat Animal Research Center at Clay Center, Nebraska. I've been working with Mark, as we call it, since 2010 on fine-tuning their grazing program and extending their grazing season, even though, that's a research organization and it's the government and they have unlimited money, which no, they don't. They face the same stresses of high cost of production that cuts into their research budgets, that just like commercial producers, they are very, very interested in how do they extend their grazing season and reduce their winter feed costs. So we've been working on this, and this is a set of samples that were taken. You can see the first set was in November, and the second set in January. And the same individual took all of these samples, and he was trained to do this. He knew what he was doing. Where was I going? Okay, and they're all imitation grab samples except that bottom one that says mature big blue stem whole plant. And what I really want to contrast in this case, the first contrast I want to make is the big blue stem regrowth that you see higher up on the table. And I can't explain why the January sample actually shows up with a higher feed quality than the November sample. Yeah, you get some variation in sampling out there. But the point is that basically that regrowth big blue stem is, we don't need to see my security report. That regrowth big blue stem without supplementation shows to be adequate for a dry pregnant cow. Drop to the bottom of the page at the mature big blue stem whole plant, and we have horrible feed, almost no protein. The energy content is barely at maintenance, or it's even a little below, and we have a terrible ratio of crude protein to energy. That pasture on the bottom line there would need a lot of protein supplementation and some energy supplementation at all. If we look at the tall fescue regrowth at the top line, and we could drop down and look either at the mixed grass regrowth or the orchard grass, we see that all of those are really good feed. And the smooth brome, and this one I don't even want to talk about, because I've actually myself, I have never seen smooth brome grass be that high quality at Stockpile. But that's what the data said, and it was regrowth. The point is, we can make these species selections. We can make the decision of timing of grazing of the pastures that we're stockpiling for winter to create far more higher quality feed than most people imagine that you can have in stockpiled winter feed. So that's that news. When we think about that protein supplementation, as I said earlier, monogastrics require consumption of intact amino acids on a daily basis. Ruminants do not. Monogastrics, we are a flow-through everyday feed system. Ruminants are a batch processing digestive system. So we can throw protein in there about every 3 days and get as good a performance, certainly with dry cows or dry ewes or stockers that we're kind of roughing through the winter and then going to capitalize on compensatory gain. Every 3 days, give them protein and they will do just fine. Another thing we have to understand is what we call rate of passage. And that is how fast, because remember I said rumination is a batch processing system. So how long does it take for the fiber, the grass that the cow ate today, to pass through the entire digestive process and be the waste material be excreted? That's determined by 2 factors. It's the digestibility of the fiber and the availability of nitrogen. On very high digestibility feeds like we see in the spring and early summer of the year, the rate of passage might be as short as 12 to 24 hours. There's high digestibility in the fiber, there's plenty of protein in the diet, so it moves through quickly. When we go to dormant feed, that could stretch out to 72 to 96 hours. If we have low digestibility fiber and a low protein level, then it can be 8 to 10 days. And if that's the case, the animal falls over dead. Its rumen, its stomach is stuffed full, but it's completely plugged up because we don't have nitrogen to feed the microbes that run the fermentation. So what we're generally looking for is trying to keep that rate of passage in about 36 to 48, 54-hour time range. If we can keep the rate of passage at that level, and remember that's driven by fiber digestibility and nitrogen availability, if we can keep the rate of passage in that time frame, animal performances pretty well. So there's our resource that we have to work with, brown dead grass out there. Now we have to think about how the animal approaches this resource and how they're going to graze it. When we use set stocking, so this is where we have a big field and we put some animals out there and we expect that field to feed them for, I don't know, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months, 6 months. That's set stocking. Just turn them out and let it happen. When we set stock, animals are going to select what they want. And usually in a dormant pasture situation, what they're wanting is protein. They are keying in for high protein plants. So we put these animals into this field where we looked at it and said, that ought to feed them for 2 months. In the first 2 to 3 weeks out there, they're going to travel that entire area and they're going to high grade out the high protein material. And so what we're left with is a bunch of low digestibility stems. And if we do not supplement them with protein, once they've gleaned the natural pasture protein out of there, they're going to lose body condition, not rebreed, die, and all kinds of other stuff. This is what most of your neighbors do. They turn them out, let the animals do very well, let them high grade the pasture for a few weeks, and then they're stuck with feeding protein supplement or go to a full ration of hay for the remainder of the winter. That is an expensive approach to wintering cattle. So we put them out in that big field first day, she eats whatever she wants. By the 30th day or the 100th day, whatever it is, she's not eating what nearly she needs to. Again, if we just stand here and we look across the field and say, well, there's plenty of feed out there. Well, there might be plenty of feed, but it's not the right feed. So this is where strip grazing comes in. If we use strip grazing to manage rumen function, we change selective grazing from being a negative in the pasture to being a positive management tool. Because what we're going to do is we're going to ration out the protein. We know that protein is needed by the rumen microbes to digest the fiber and release energy. Rate of passage, here I said 36 to 72 hours. I'd really like to keep that down to 54 on there. But as we understand the animal's propensity to selectively graze, when we understand that a certain amount of protein is needed by the rumen microbes to keep the rumen properly functioning, and we have to manage rate of passage so the animal doesn't plug up, we can start doing much more effective passage. This figure here, this is from work we did when I was at the University of Missouri Forage Systems Research Center, and it compares the protein content of stockpiled tall fescue legume pastures by 2 weeks increments over the course of the winter. Now, the old research that was done in the 1950s, 60s, 70s said the protein content of stockpiled pastures steadily declines over the course of the winter. Well, all that research was done with set stocking. You look at those yellow bars, and that is exactly the conclusion that you would draw. That protein content steadily declines over the course of the winter. Now we go to the controlled grazing, and this was done on 3-day feed allocations. So each one of those green bars is the representation of 5 3-day grazing increments. And what you see is that the crude protein content of the pasture actually declined very little till after the first of the year. The decline, what the old research saw was not a physical weathering. It was not a degradation of the standing forage. What you see in those yellow bars is the product of allowing the animals to selectively graze all the high protein material out early in the grazing season. When we control the grazing, we have the opportunity to ration out the protein in that pasture. And if we do it on a 3-day basis, we come back to the idea, the rumen does not need continuous input of protein, dosing protein to the rumen every 3 days. Hey, you know what strip grazing is? Strip grazing in and of itself is an act of protein supplementation. We do allow the animal to come in there on day 1 and go through and high grade protein out. And that's the boost in the rumen that gets the bugs cranking And then we coast out the next 2 days on the fiber that's left in the plants there. So if we match strip graze period to the rumen rate of passage, we can optimize animal nutrition and labor demand. The cost, and we have had a number of clients across the Western US who have either dramatically reduced or completely eliminated their protein supplementation regimen when they went to controlled grazing. Huge money saver. So what does it mean? We feed the bugs first. That's where we start. They need a digestible substrate for an energy source. That is the plant fiber. They need a nitrogen source, and that can either be true protein or non-protein nitrogen source like urea. We feed the animals second. We have to keep rumen function properly going, taking care of the microbes. They then feed the animals. Most of what a cow or a ewe lives on as protein going down to the small intestine is microbial protein. Yes, in some forages and feeds, there's bypass proteins, but the majority of what they're depending on is dead microbes. VFAs are volatile fatty acids. That's your acetic, lactic, propionic acid. That's the product of rumen fermentation. That's an energy source. And the VFAs are absorbed directly through the walls of the rumen. And then we have other sugars, the product of fermentation and decomposition of fiber, passing from the rumen down into the true stomach. This is what strip grazing does for you. It preserves winter feed supply deeper into the winter because animals aren't walking back and forth across it, trampling it down, pooping on it, wasting it. It preserves forage quality deeper into the winter. We just saw that with the crude protein graft contrasting, controlled grazing, and set stocking. It improves animal condition deeper into the winter because they have more feed, better feed, and that raises the overall performance of your livestock. That's what strip grazing in the winter can do. And I often say this, in the cow-calf business, there's far more money to be made with controlled grazing in the winter months than there is with controlled grazing in the summer months. In the summer, the alternative to that bite of green grass growing over there is the bite of green grass growing over here. In the winter, the alternative to that standing pasture is mechanically harvested forage that might cost 2 to 3 times much per day to feed a cow. So if we can preserve our forage supply later into the winter, keep it higher quality, that is a much lower cost approach to wintering livestock. So year-round grazing isn't going to happen by accident. I always say that the planning for your winter grazing needs to start before the first blade of grass appears in the spring. You have to have a stocking plan, you have to have a cattle flow plan, and you have to have a forage inventory on an ongoing basis. You need to know what your resources are. And, we can look at these growth curve things and talk about warm season grasses, cool season grasses, forage legumes, summer annuals, winter annuals. These are all opportunities to have grazing at different times of the year. Most ranches or farms are not fortunate enough to have all of these resources available, but a surprising number of them are. And the more you understand where your peaks of production and where your troughs are, and figure out what could I have growing on the place to fill those spots, and if you can't have them growing at that time, what can I stockpile to have available in that time? So you want to understand what you have. You want to build a calendar of forage supply with a pasture inventory. This is one of the big things that Maya Grazing does for us. Once we start keeping our grazing records and then have the opportunity to project what future growth is going to be, or actually go through and enter values of available forage. And I prefer to do that as AUDs per acre. Some people use, pounds of dry matter per acre or kilograms per hectare. However you do the inventory, man, that is a critical tool for being being able to develop your year-round grazing plan. When we come to the end of the growing season, if we take an inventory at that time, that pretty well tells us what we're going to have to work with. Now, there will be some deterioration of forage over the winter due to snow, ice, wind, things like that. What's interesting is the amount of deterioration is not as much as most people believe it is. When I was at Missouri, we did these measurements throughout the winter, and we knew what the animals were taking. We knew what we were losing to winter deterioration. When we moved to Idaho and had to start contending with elk, big herds of elk, deer, antelope, also out there eating our winter feed resources, we had to factor that in too. The better job you do of monitoring what is happening to your standing forage supply in the winter, the more accurately you're going to be able to set your stocking rate to go through the winter without getting, a surprise 30 days before spring and being totally out of feed. That's what we want to avoid doing. So that inventory just helps you decide, more or less forage what to do. So actually, I thought we were going into tools right now, but here's kind of a last summary of strategically using your stockpiled pastures. Don't think all or nothing for a particular livestock class. This is an important concept. Even in looking at dormant season forage, there's a bite of finishing quality feed out there. There's some growing quality feed, there's maintenance feed. You may only have dry, pregnant cows on the ranch and nothing else. And if that's the case, well, that's easy. You just let them eat everything. But if you're in the direct market grass-fed beef business or grass-fed lamb, and you need to be killing animals year-round, and you need to be harvesting animals year-round, and wanting it to be grass-based, you really need to understand that some of your stockpile pastures, they still have maybe 10 to 15% finishing quality feed in there. So you can put those finishing animals in there and only ask them to eat that much of it. If you have stockers that you're growing, the question becomes, do you want them to grow at 3/4 of a pound, pound and a half through the winter? Again, you can ask them to just eat that part of the plant that has that nutrition in it and go on from there. And then we use cows to clean up the rest. Key principle here, underestimate your forage supply and overestimate your demand. When you're doing your feed planning for the season, that's a real important concept. Now, we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about tools and techniques for winter grazing. These pictures are in the winter and we're out there using tools. We began really seriously getting into intensive management of winter pastures in 1988. We were doing some feed budgeting and rationing out feed in the winter prior to that time. This is back when we were in Missouri, so we had our personal farm in Missouri, and I was also at the research station. 1988 was a severe drought. And that's the year that I began doing daily rotations on pastures. And at the research station, it's the year we went to 3-day strip grazing on stockpiled pasture rather than for years. They've been doing it bi-weekly. You never give them 2 weeks worth and move on from there. To stretch that feed supply out, we started going 3 days in winter grazing. And the difference in how effectively the animals use the pastures, how much better they maintained body condition, it was just an absolute night and day difference between 2 weeks and 3 days. The remarkable thing is, even though we started the winter with substantially less stockpiled forage, if memory serves me correctly, we had about 60% standing biomass in the pastures compared to what we typically had been doing with stockpiled pastures. And yet we grazed further into the winter than we ever had before because we were rationing out the feed. Part of the reason we were just doing 2-week moves in the early to mid 80s is because we were using 14 gauge wire on rebar posts with plastic insulators that in the winter, would get cold and break. We were using crap equipment. And we did learn that if we were going to move electric fences in the winter in frozen ground on a every 3-day basis, and I eventually, progressed to, by the early 90s, I was doing it every day. And you need to have tools that you can actually work with comfortably in wintry conditions to be motivated to go out there and move fence that much. If it's an easy job, you will be much more willing to do it. So one of the first concerns that people encounter is, how do you get a step-in post in frozen ground? Now, I've had the privilege over really now, certainly the last 30 years, but we started 40 years ago. We had the opportunity to evaluate all kinds of fence products. And we have used just about every step-in post developed anywhere in the world. Once we got into the later 1980s and through the 1990s, once the Forage Systems Research Center developed a reputation of being one of the best grazing research stations in the US, all the fence companies wanted us to try their stuff out. And so we accommodated them, and we found that there's a bunch of junk out there. There's some things they work just great in the summertime, but as soon as you get into frozen ground, they collapse, kind of like this yellow post on the left side. So over the course of all those years, what we have found as the plastic step-in post that we can use year-round is what we call the True O'Brien. We call it the True O'Brien because there's a whole bunch of knockoffs, posts that look just like an O'Brien, but they are not. The O'Brien is still made in New Zealand. And these two posts here, the O'Brien and the other one I'm just calling Brand X. And by the way, O'Brien does make a yellow step-in post also, but this is not an O'Brien step-in. They're basically the same plastic polymer. 93% of that step-in post is the plastic polymer, 7% is the UV stabilizer. And those are plus or minus numbers a little bit, but that's pretty well what it is. The failure of the knockoffs in terms of plastic brittleness, which I think we'll see on the next slide, is not because they're using lousy plastic per se, it's because they're using lousy UV stabilizers. O'Brien has never changed what they use for UV stabilization. The knockoffs made in China, they use whatever the cheapest thing on the market is. And so from one batch to the next, you don't know what you're going to get. So the O'Brien here, the point I want to make here is that straight spike on the base of the O'Brien, that's a 3/16 inch high tensile rod. And it has greater tensile strength than what any of the other posts are using. That's why I can put an O'Brien in frozen ground. And yeah, I've grazed at -20, -25 and still put posts in the ground. You don't stomp them in. You use kind of a rocking motion with your foot, and you more drill them in. Some of these knockoffs, they simply do not have the strength in the spike to penetrate frozen ground. Another thing, some of the other step-ins have much larger diameter spikes, 5/16. Try to use a fiberglass, fiber rod, a 3/8 inch fiber rod in the wintertime. You can't pound those things in the ground without getting them split. But if you think about the old water flow principle of double the diameter, you quadruple the water flow. A 2-inch pipe doesn't flow just twice as much water as a 1-inch pipe. It flows 4 times as much. And so the physical resistance of the ground of trying to put a 3/8 inch diameter post into the ground compared to a 3/16, there's 4 times the ground resistance to that. This is what I was talking about, cold brittle. Again, blue post that looks just like the O'Brien, but I know it's not because an O'Brien has 4 of those super wide hooks on the backside. This one does not. So that's clearly not an O'Brien post. The tip, the spike, again, softer steel, it folds over. I have 20-year-old O'Brien posts that in the wintertime, I can bend in a complete U and have it come back to a straight position. Most of these knockoffs, you get a 30-degree bend in them and they will shatter in the cold. The other post that we found that we can use in the wintertime is the Gallagher ring top. It's a quarter shank and spike. Most pigtails are 5/16, and I did make the mistake saying that it's a single spike with footstep. The footstep on a Gallagher ring top does have a spike on it, but it's not near as long as what the most pigtails have. Most pigtails, if you get the main spike into the ground, you will then get obstructed by the secondary strike there. All right. So these ones we've used effectively in the wintertime. So we like those. Another thing we like about the ring tops, as opposed to the O'Briens for making sharp turns, and a lot of times I will use, most of my line I will put in with the O'Briens, but if I need to make corners, I will set 2 of these ring tops just side by side. The ring top over here, this is what we call an enhanced ring top. It's got 3 additional wire clips on it, so you can put up a multi-wire fence for, sheep or goats or something. And what I've found is rather than making a bend and running through the top rings, I go down to this first clip, and there's not near as much strain on the fence that way. Okay, so geared reels are important. A 3-to-1 gear ratio rolls up a whole lot faster than a straight crank reel does. And if it's, 10 degrees, 0, -10, having a reel that cranks up a lot faster gets you out of the cold and back to the house faster. So geared reels to me are essential. I'm not near as particular on reels as I am on the step-in posts. These are 5 brands that I've got in my daily toolkit. They all work well. I like them all. You can see there is some price variation on them. Standard reel like that, 400 meters or 1,320 foot of polywire. I'm going to say there's 2 reels in here that I'm going to say a little bit more about. This one is the PowerFlex twin hook reel, and the twin hooks on it give it a lot more stability. All the other reels just have a single narrow metal hook that you hang over the wire or into a reel standard. With this twin hook reel, and you can see in the picture that I have it actually straddling a in that case it's a Pasture Pro, the wood plastic composite post. But fiberglass sucker rod, PowerFlex G2s, Pasture Pros, any of those posts, you can put 1 hook on each side of the line post and it gives you much greater stability. Now, if it looks like this handle is not centered on the reel, it is not, and that's deliberate, because you have the crank over there on the right-hand side, and I thought it was screwy at first too when I first saw it, but then started using it. In terms of being ergonomically pleasing, this is an outstanding reel. By having that handle offset from the center, it actually balances out much better. The weak point on these reels is these high impact plastic hooks can break. They are screwed through the frame. You can put a metal hook on there if you want to replace it. You can put a wood hook on there. You can put a plastic hook on there. You can just make something and, you know, get it to where it works. This is a Gallagher reel, and the key thing that makes Gallagher reels attractive to a lot of people is this knuckle guard. If you're definitely afraid of being shocked while you're reeling up polywire because you didn't unhook it at the other end or something, this knuckle guard really protects you from getting shocked. The shape of the handle is very comfortable too. Now, that's the most expensive reel that we sell. Our price is 69 bucks on it. The Tarragate, which a lot of people use, and I just saw it, you know, on the On Pasture newsletter today. Greg Judy had, you know, his videos of how to use reels, and he talked up the Tarragate. We sell Tarragate reels. I probably use more Tarragates than anything. They used to be the cheapest reel out there. The Powerflex Twin Hook is actually a cheaper reel now. But find one that you're comfortable with, that you can get the job done in as short a time as possible in the winter. On the subject of short a time as possible, if you have longer stretches, you know, there's mega reels. They hold a half a mile or 800 meters of wire. And I use them occasionally. I've got several of them because I don't run many stretches of fence longer than 1,000 feet or so. I don't need the mega reels. I just have certain jobs that I use them for. They are more awkward to use. You just have more weight. They're a little broader out in front of you, but they certainly are useful in, you know, certain applications. All right, so sometimes you're not running your reels to an existing fence or something, and you have to, you know, create a corner just out there in the open. There's some different ways of doing it. This one here is what's called a power post. It's marketed, it's made in Canada, marketed by Powerflex, by American GrazingLands Services too, and I'm not sure who else might have them. But the interesting thing about this is the main body of the post down here is actually a slide hammer. And so you just raise this up, bam, 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 and you hammer the spike into the ground, good, you know, 10-inch 3/8 by 3/8 spike. And the base of it does have a foot with a secondary spike to stabilize it in the direction of pull. You can run up to 3 reels off of one of these, and you'll notice that the second one I have on here is one of those Powerflex twin hooks, and I've got it hung horizontally and a fence running out the other direction there. Now those things cost 114 bucks, and I know some of you folks out there are frugal. If you're frugal, you might want to look at a cheaper alternative. These are do-it-yourself reel standards, and they're simply rebar with a cap and a reel holder on it. You know, scrap material and 30 minutes in the shop, and you've got reel standards. This one here, you can actually run 4 directions on, and you can see, because it's welded, or the strap is flat across the top, you can hammer that, you know, into the ground quite well. So pictures like this are available on the internet. You can see how to do it, and that will hold your costs down. I'd love to sell you half a dozen of those, you know, power posts, but for most people, this do-it-yourself alternative makes more sense. This is something that, you know, I just saw on a ranch. They made them for themselves. And if you're in a place where rail fences are common, like they are, you know, here in Idaho, Montana, places like that, or if you have H braces, you know, built from oil filled pipe or whatever, this just U-shaped deal, hang it over a reel, or excuse me, hang it over a rail, hang your reel on it, and you got a good support there. Thing that always bothered me about this picture is you can see the lock is here. The handle is run down the bottom. The handle should be coming off the top. I do not know why this individual have their handles on upside down. I don't know. All right, so the bottom line here is, you know, grazing out in cold weather is not bad if you got the right tools. This picture on the left, whoop, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, this picture over here on the left, I do know for a fact that that was a minus 20 degree, you know, Fahrenheit morning, and we're out there, you know, moving fence, feeding cows. Said, if the chore is going to take you 3 hours to move a quarter mile of fence, you are not going to be highly motivated to do it in the wintertime. If you can do it in 30, 35 minutes, it'll be all right. Okay, I'm going to stop my share, send it back to you, Carl, and we can go from there.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. I'll just share this again. If you could just give me the nod that you've come back up on the screen there with your reeling in at minus 20.
I'm there.
Fantastic. Well, look, I really enjoyed that, Jim, and I think that last section when we're talking about tools, you know, I guess that's it's a good segue to what I just thought I'd throw up next, and that is essentially Maya Grazing is just another tool, right? And it's so much of what we're about is being able to say, okay, what actually do we have to work with? So I thought it would be worthwhile, just a few of you may have seen this sort of sequence of just a couple of screenshots before, but I thought it's worth just actually having a look at a little bit about this planning and how you're talking there about, you know, underestimating your supply and overestimating your demand. So we can really conservatively look at, okay, well, do we actually have enough to get through the winter with our stockpile feed, with our strip grazing, etc. So I just thought I'd share this. So what I've got here is just in the planning area of Maya Grazing. We're just looking at some of the graze planning tools and replanting tools, which are incredibly simple to use. And I guess that was the other point that I sort of took away from just that last bit of the presentation, Jim, was when you were talking about tools that you're able to work with comfortably. So the usability of tools, whether it's the physical wire reel with a geared winder, or whether it's your ability to actually calculate a graze plan and look at your feed and supply, feed supply and your demand, and to ascertain the fact, well, do I actually have enough to get through this winter grazing period, or how long am I going to be able to get in before I do need to be looking at that supplementary feeding if we haven't quite got to the point of year-round grazing. So what we've got here is just a quick example of, we've got our different pastures listed out here on the left-hand side. We know the acreages here. We've also provided this estimate of how much feed that we actually have in the pasture. You mentioned there, Jim, that you like to work in AUDs. This one's put in here as pounds of dry matter per acre. It can be AUDs. We work in all different methods within the tool, so it's not a problem. So if we know how much we've actually pounds of dry matter or AUDs we have in each of these pastures, and we know the length of period of which we're trying to graze through, Maya Grazing does the maths and just allows us to say, well, what's the estimated period of time that you need to be able to run those grazes in each of those pastures, taking into account your residual, of course, as well. And you know, in terms of usability and to be able to work with this tool comfortably in it, to be able to tell you something which actually of value, here we're looking at, based on our feed availability, our residual targets, we're eating into about 75% of our available feed. So that might be where you're able to actually go into this graze plan with some comfort. I thought that was just an example of tooling on the software side and where we're sitting at, just as relevant, if not more relevant, at the front end before you go and get your reels and before you start to do your strip grazing, etc. Because you really have to know what you're working with, and this can be adjusted as the season goes on. Thought we'd jump over to some of the questions now, Jim. We've got a whole bunch of them coming in, and so we'll probably run questions for, I'd say, about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll run another session in the next few days, and we'll get a recorded Q&A out. But one was a pretty one that came in was I was looking at. I'm just looking for the. Here from Jordan. A bit of a long question, but just to paraphrase, it was about looking at the quality of the pastures as the season progresses. And Jordan's talking about in Missouri, extremely wet winters seem to result in some decline and weathering of even non-grazed stockpile by the time of February and March come around. What would be the solutions there, Jim? I know you've got a lot of experience in Missouri.
Yeah, my experience in Missouri, though, was when it was a lot colder and winters were not the wet, muddy mess that they've become. Yes, when we have rain in the winter instead of snow, there is some leaching of nutrition out of the forage. And so one of the things to do, again, a lot of people would be surprised at how much value is still retained, but it's probably going to be worthwhile to take some forage samples as you go through the winter to monitor what's going on, to help you make a better decision about whether or not you need to be supplementing feed. What we do know is the shorter and tighter the grazing period, the better the nutrition will remain. And so I'm not sure what kind of management frequency Jordan's on right now, but usually shorter grazing periods do help the animals harvest a bigger bite and better quality forage.
Thanks, Jim. One from Alison was talking about supplemental feed, and if that's a requirement because clearly there's just there's too much snow or ice or what have you, and not able to graze for a little while. What are the things that you really need to think about to get the animals back grazing when the weather allows? Now, I've seen some pretty extreme scenarios where cattle are still grazing in snow and ice or what have you, but no doubt there's, of course, the scenarios where it may well be quite difficult. So what are the things we need to consider before the animals can get back to grazing if we've been supplementary feeding?
Okay, you really need to closely monitor animal body condition. And the better stock person you are, the better you're going to recognize that they've started on a downhill slide. Some people their cows lose a whole body condition score before they realize that something's gone amiss. So routinely monitoring your cattle for body condition score is real important. And then if you've been feeding, hay for a while and you want the animals to go back out to grazing, you might cut the ration to half, let them get some hay, but have them out grazing. And then, over a week to 10 days, wean them completely off of that hay. I know some people just go cold turkey and move the cows from stored feed to a kind of sodden stockpile pasture and get along with it. Some people, do not. Part of it is the type of cow that you have. The more what I would call a range type cow compared to a farm type cow, the better they can move back and forth from stored feed to rough feed.
Great, thanks, Jim. We've got quite a few questions regarding water during winter and strip grazing, and what's the best approach when we have large pastures and only sort of single water points or what have you. I think that sort of hails back to some of our design principles that we've talked about on other webinars. But if there's I'm not sure if there's some general guidance there in terms of what's the best way to sort of set yourself up for winter grazing when your water points are limited.
Okay. Some important considerations are typically in the winter, because it's cooler, and a lot of times we have non-lactating animals, but main thing that it's cooler, the water demand is not near as great as what it is in the summertime. So we're willing to let cattle walk much further in the winter to access water than we are in the active growing season, especially in a hot environment. So if we have a single water source in a big pasture, several hundred acre pasture, we will begin our strip grazing around the water point, and then we will move out from that. We'll just keep, each time we create a new strip, we're moving away from the water. We're marching away from the water, and we'll let the animals come back to it. Now, in a dry environment that's actually cold, that works really, really well. In a area where it doesn't freeze and it stays wet most of the winter, you can start getting a lot of tracking damage going back there. And if that's the case, you might want to create a temporary lane along one side of the field to take them back to that water. It has to get a little bit bad before I want to resort to a lane. We need to monitor it, see what's happening to the ground. But key, the primary strategy is we start grazing at water, and then we work our way away from it. And if that one water tank is located, more centrally in the field and not at one end, then we would put what I would call a baseline fence. Usually it's still a temporary fence, put up with polywire or something, but we will split the field coming by that tank and graze it in kind of 4 quadrants, northwest of the tank, then northeast and southeast and southwest. That shortens the distances that you are moving temporary fences and makes it an easier task.
Sure. Yeah. Now, there's a couple of questions along those lines, so perhaps that could be another session. A question from Jeddah down in the Gulf Coast region. So the old timers tell us that we can't stockpile for winter because of mold in the dormant plants. Have you ever encountered that, and what are your thoughts on that, Jim? And unfortunately, fortunately, we're going to for everyone, we'll wrap up on the next question. Yeah, Jim, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, mold and rotting forage in stockpile situations in the Gulf Coast region is a real problem and a common problem. Awful lot of the forage down there is, of course, subtropical warm season grasses that are not very nutritious in the dormant season anyway, compounded with getting saturated with mold, makes it really crappy feed. Down in that environment, I think you are far better off trying to grow winter annual forages, ryegrass, cereal rye, oats, the winter clovers, brassicas, things like that, and grazing fresh feed rather than, stockpiled subtropicals.
Great, thanks, Jim. And the last one, JT from Wyoming, and that's all about pasture observations and getting your estimates within plus minus acceptable percentage to go into this with the graze planning. And that's what's the best method to get your estimates on track, and how do I get there as quickly as possible? Okay,
that's a real interesting question, because I just got back Sunday from a 21-day, 4,000-mile, 7-state consulting trip. And the last stop that I went to is a ranch in eastern Wyoming that I have visited every year for the last either 4 or 5 years. And in a 2-day period, the owner and I cover 14,000 acres of winter rangeland. And it's split up in, I think, about 50 pastures. And we just do a visual estimate of how many AUDs per acre we think are in there. The first year I did it with him and, gave him my estimate. And so this is a guy who's used to getting just 3 or 4 AUDs per acre in winter range grazing. And, when I started saying numbers, like 9, 11, he was real skeptical. And when we went to one place and I said 18, he said, I'm crazy. You're crazy as an effing loon. And so he grazed it according to that winter, though, and it turned out that's what was there. And so if you have rangeland, large areas that you're grazing in the winter, doing that assessment and then grazing according to that assessment is the fastest way to learn. And it is a powerful, powerful tool. Really allowed, that fella to be much more comfortable with the idea of having nothing more than a month's worth of hay, on hand for when there were blizzards or things, and, confident increasing the number of cows that he could carry in the winter. So it's a powerful, powerful tool. And just as a heads up on that, I think that we are going to try next fall, probably in September, to do a range school on that very topic. And that would probably, take place there in eastern Wyoming.
Okay, that's great to know, Jim. I mean, we've talked a bunch of times about this particular topic, and people's ability to get their eye in. It's far less work if it's a focused task. And we've talked, about between 25 and 35 deliberate pasture observations. Sort of tends to get you reasonably well calibrated to a position which can give you repeatable results, and whether you compare any method. And I guess it doesn't cost you anything once you calibrate your eye.
That is correct. The New Zealanders showed this way back, 40 to 50 years ago, that statistically the trained eye is as accurate as any tool we use, any instrument we use in research to measure forage yield.
Yeah, and I must say that off the data, we've got thousands of users of MyGrazing all over the planet. We can see in the data those that are actually making estimates and just religiously, whether they're developing a grazing plan or not, but just putting estimates in when they go into a graze and when they come out of a graze, look over their shoulder, having an estimate to see what is left behind. The cattle will tell you what they've taken out. So that's a bit of a calibration tool in and of itself. But we can see through the data that those that make those estimates are far more likely to be in line with managing their stocking rate to carrying capacity. It's quite clear in the data. So it's a very powerful thing. So we'll move on. Now we're just wrapping things up, but I'd like to thank you, Jim, for another wonderful presentation, and also Stockman Grass Farmer to help make this possible again. Stockman Grass Farmer recently, with Stockman Grass Farmer Digital, have released this next piece of work, which is management intensive grazing. And we've got a bundled offer when you purchase that with MyGrazing to save quite a significant chunk of change there. So be in touch with us or Stockman Grass Farmer to follow through on that offer. And I'd also like to just highlight that this whole focus of graze planning is something that we do hand in glove with every single one of our customers here. Our success is essentially your success, or your success is our success. So it's a bit of a mutual community orientated business that we've got here. It's not just a matter of having users of the software out there and we'll see you next year for renewing your subscription. Our approach is very much one of outcomes focused and working with every single customer to go through the development of your grazing plans and working that out. So any new customer that comes on board, we will absolutely get down in the dirt with you to work out how to develop these grazing plans over for the upcoming season. So get in touch with us, learn more about that Stockman Grass Farmer deal. I've been through that digital school that they recorded with Jim earlier in the year. It's absolutely fantastic. If you'd like to book a discovery session to see what Myer Grazing could do with you with your upcoming grazing plans this winter, we'd love to speak to you. No obligation to run a few calculations to see how we might be able to help out. Be in touch with us, and until next time, happy grazing. Hang in on the webinar now, and you'll get some more information flow through, and you'll get something in the inbox in a few days too. So thanks again, Jim, and happy grazing, everyone.
Yep. Thanks for the opportunity.